I think we'll get started. I know a lot of people are still joining, and we welcome all of you and thank you for attending. Welcome to our Back in Business Guidance for Returning to the Workplace webinar. I know you're all eager to hear from the experts that have graciously made themselves available for our members, so I'll be brief. I just want to mention a few things. Thank you to the speakers who've made time to be here when their time is definitely in high demand. And to our members who have been incredible and who've been incredible partners throughout the pandemic. We want to recognize the confusing and frustrating road you've been on over the past 12 plus months. Our team has published a basic return to work guide that you can find on our website that will be regularly updated as more information is made available, and we hope you'll use it. Today's webinar is intended to give you all what clarity is possible and help you plan your reopening and welcome your staff and customers back in the safest way possible. Our speakers today are the best of the best. First, we've got the San Diego County's Chief Resiliency Officer, Gary Johnston. Gary will speak to safe reopening processes and the county's role in it. Next is a medical consultant of the county, Dr. Sayone. He'll answer questions if any come up that he can help with. Both these gentlemen are regulars at the county's business briefings, which I'm sure you all frequent like chamber staff does. And our third speaker is Marie Burke-Kenny, a partner at Procopio Law, who will speak to us about some of the vulnerabilities employees face and how to plan ahead. We'll hear from all three speakers and then turn to Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gary Johnston to kick us off. Gary, thank you for being here.
Jerry, thanks. And thanks everybody for inviting myself and Dr. Thihalolipavan, or Dr. Sayone as he is known. He's in the wings. He's my wingman, so to speak, on all things that really get after some of the specific public health aspects. He's also tremendously well versed in reopening. What we put together is just really a handful of very high level slides. I will just tell you that just like we were talking about before we came on the air, is that we were making updates to these slides at the last minute. I wasn't able to get to a couple updates, but I'll talk you through a couple of those as we go. But really want to focus and give you the opportunity to come after myself and Sayone on any questions you might have as we approach the 15th. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, we can keep. Yeah, just that's a no-brainer. It's rapidly changed. It changed last night. So let's just go. There we go. Okay, so what we do know, back on the 21st, really it started off on 6 April. They put out a basic CDPH, California Department of Public Health, put out a very brief 1.5-page memo about, hey, what we could expect with respect to 15 June and the retirement of the blueprint. It was reinforced and a little bit more meat put on the bone on the 21st of May, where they came out and again indicated that on 15 June, all industries across the state would be able to reopen. We're going to fully reopen the economy. But the words that I always focus on, and I quote, is usual operations. And all of those that were listed on what we call the CDPH blueprint business tiers and activities table. Essentially, that captured all of your major businesses, your sectors. It also addressed our schools, and I can talk to anything, including schools as well, and our universities. But it essentially said that, hey, at the 15th of June, we're going back to usual operations. But we've all been kind of anticipating, where are the buts or the caveats going to come. It does say there also that it talks about just the standard being vigilant, the masks, and we're going to talk about masks because that is an update as of last night, and I can give you some wave tops on the new guidance if you haven't already had a chance to see it. It is the CDPH public face covering guidance on mask wearing. Let's go to the next slide. This is essentially what was actually pulled right out of the document, a chart here that basically says, outside of a mega event, there's two mega events, two categories: indoor, outdoor. Indoor mega being anything over 5,000, outdoor mega being anything over 10,000. But with those set aside, there's no vaccination verification or testing requirements at all for any of our normal business and activities. Capacity limits, no restrictions. Physical distancing when we get to the 15th, no restrictions for attendees, customers, or guests. Now, again, notice how it said that. There is some, Cal OSHA is a different story, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Then there's the masking. This was the one that was really of concern to most folks because it did tell us back on the 21st of May that for masking, we refer to the CDPH guidance. Well, up until last night, it said that everybody had to wear a face covering no matter what your vaccination status was inside, unless it was your own residence. That obviously has changed as of last night. I'll hit some wave tops orally on that. And then as far as travelers, which is important to a lot of us out there, the CDC recommendations and the public health travel advisory, again, an advisory, not a mandate, are still obviously in play. So those are really kind of capture the big four, a lot of the things that I talk about with respect to concerns about what we can and can't do on the public side. Next slide. So in addition, obviously you got the workplace, and I have a slide here that will just basically introduce the Cal OSHA discussion. So we'll talk about that. The one thing that I would just say is that this is a challenge because a lot of our workplaces, even the county's offices, are going to have interface with the public. And what we're going to see is what we've been seeing for quite some time, almost diametrically opposed guidance for if you're in an employee status compared to when you leave work, you become in the public status. There's a lot of differences, and this is causing a lot of confusions. But these are some of the things that they continue to want folks to focus on. Let's go to the next slide. And this is kind of our Cal OSHA slide that we put together, but guess what? It's already overcome by events because they had another emergency meeting last night. But this was the way it kind of laid out. We had the guidance documents were out as of 5/28 for public. The update, and these are emergency temporary standards. I believe most of you know what those are. They're particular standards for COVID protection and prevention within the workforce. They were due to expire, so they had to come up for a vote anyways. But 6-3, they did go for a vote with some updated draft ETSs. Some of the results of that made the Union Tribune, but they did decide on those ETSs. Then it went to the state's office, administrative law office, for a review. And then there was the fact that the public health guidance was going to change for face coverings fairly significantly and more closely in line with CDC. So they went into an emergency meeting that ran from about 5 o'clock to about 9 o'clock last night. And so this is what I know orally, folks. And again, I'm a very open person. I'm going to tell you what I know. But again, this came orally from some of our folks that had been basically tuned into the call last night, is that they will go back to the drawing board, update another set of draft ETSs by the 17th of June, ultimately with the plan to have those approved and released and in effect on the 28th of June. Again, those are dates that I got orally. I can't anchor anything to that right now. I just haven't had a chance to do any digging deeper. And so what I can tell you is that the current ETSs that we've been under since November are still in effect, and they don't address anything with respect to being fully vaccinated. So that's where we are. And as you know, in these ETSs, there is a mandatory requirement to have a COVID prevention plan between the employer and the employees. That is not necessarily public facing. It's different than the safe reopening plan that we post outside of windows of our stores. That's more public facing, and we can talk about that if you have a question on the SRP or the safe reopening plans. So that's kind of where we are, folks. Very fluid situation. I'm a little bit upset about it because we were hoping that we would have kind of concurrent, nested, aligned guidance coming out from these two major organizations, CDPH and Cal OSHA, on the same day, that being next Tuesday. It's not going to happen, but we'll get through it. Next slide. These are just some resources that we typically provide to you, but it also offers me a good opportunity to highlight these documents that you see there tiled on the right. These blue documents that you see basically go away along with the tiered system. It gets retired on the 15th. So within the tiered system, These documents basically refer to that. So when you open the industry guidance for office spaces, you open the industry guidance for restaurants, it will tell you, what you can and can't do, given what tier you're in, what capacity, what have you. All these documents absolutely are retired along with the tiered system and the blueprint. And then you can see the safe reopening plan template that the county developed well over a year ago. And then you can even see the public health order. You can expect from this county, we'll likely, obviously, overhaul our public health order. I still think we will retain one because we're still under a declaration of emergency, and that declaration goes all the way up to the federal level. It's still active, but I believe it'll be very, very broad and probably linked to a lot of existing guidance documents that will be necessary for us to follow, at least obviously through 1 October. And so then that's probably enough. I think my next slide gets after maybe, yeah, these are just some more of the resources. I will tell you that we're going to go to an on-call press conference status. We're trying to migrate a lot of our reporting and our data to our dashboards and our portals. But we will continue to exercise our outreach capacity to keep everybody informed absolutely beyond the 15th. The pandemic is not over. And I think that's something that we need to be reminded of, quite frankly. Next slide. I think that's it, except for a few more links. Again, you should have access or be given access to all these slides. And then you always have access to me and Dr. Sayone, whatever we can do to support any of your questions, concerns, we're happy to do that. I think my next slide is my question slide. So with that, Dr. Sayone and myself will be standing by for the Q&A. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jerry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Marie for her presentation. And then I see the questions coming in. Thanks, guys. Put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And then we'll do the questions for all three experts just to make sure that we're not missing anything. Okay, Marie, take it away.
Okay. So Stephanie, just let me know if you can see that.
You're good.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce, not just for inviting me to participate, but also for providing such valuable services, programs, resources to San Diego businesses. I'm really delighted to be here with such experts like Dr. Sayone, Dr. Johnston. I have to say that when I grow up, I want to be the Chief Resiliency Officer. That's probably like the coolest title I've ever heard for a job title. Dr. Gary, I definitely want to ask you after this is all over how I get to be that. But what a great title and what an important concept, resiliency during a pandemic. So it's only been 448 days since Governor Newsom issued his stay-at-home order. I mean, think about that out loud. I remember last year when I was doing a lot of webinars, I had 6 kids and I was homeschooling, and I was like, it's day 232, and I drove my kid to the police station to report him for truancy today. So we got through all of that, and thank God our kids are back in school. What I wanted to focus on a little bit today was some employment law considerations for return to work. And I think that Dr. Gary said very well that unfortunately there's been some diametric opposition between public standards as promulgated by the CDPH and also CalOSHA, and big developments yesterday. My agenda is just basically to go over the emergency standards. I had also done a ton of slides on that and just reversed that this morning. I want to talk a little bit about mandatory vaccinations and employment, being as there's a heightened focus on vaccines, some legal issues implicated by vaccine inquiries by employers, and just a little, kind of heads up on some COVID litigation trends and preventing employment litigation. So the emergency temporary standards, as Dr. Gary said, were revised June 3, and then they were withdrawn last night, June 9, 2021. CalOSHA called a special meeting after receiving a letter from CDBH. And in the letter, CDBH said, hey, we've got some different plans and guidance for masks and distancing for the general public coming up on June 15th. And we think you should think about that. And CalOSHA convened the special meeting yesterday. and decided that, yeah, we do want to look at that. So on June 17th, Cal OSHA will vote to adopt further revisions to the emergency temporary standards with the goal of aligning with the direction and guidance from CBH. And if adopted, those new emergency temporary standards will become effective June 27, 2021. So what does that mean? What could happen after June 27? If vaccinated, will employees be required to wear a mask, even if they're a mixed company in the workplace? At this point, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, but we certainly had folks participating and listening in on the special meeting. And right now, it looks like Cal OSHA is likely to follow CDPH and CDC guidance. What about proof of vaccination status? Will employers be permitted to accept self-attestations as proof of employee vaccination status? As you saw, there's no need of proof if you're at an indoor gathering of less than 5,000. Is that going to be the same in the workplace? Cal OSHA board seem to be leaning toward requiring some sort of proof, some sort of documentation. And that's going to have some privacy implications and legal implications that I'm going to just mention to you. What about unvaccinated employees? What's going to happen with them? It's a little unclear. The draft ETS standards, or they were actually adopted, that got withdrawn yesterday, said that employers would be required to provide N95s to unvaccinated employees for voluntary use. And we think that that's still likely in terms of being an outcome. So with the shift toward distinguishing between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees in the workplace, it kind of begs the question, well, can employers mandate vaccines for employees? And it's kind of an interesting question because it implicates a federal law, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. As all of you probably know, the two vaccines, the most common, Pfizer, Moderna, they've been shown to be safe and effective up to 95%. And Dr. Sayone, please feel free to jump in as the expert here. But right now, they're still under emergency use authorization, and every consumer has a right to refuse that vaccination. So if you have a right to refuse, how does an employer mandate that you take a vaccine that you legally have a right to refuse? It's a conundrum, right? So until the vaccines receive final approval, I think that it is a risky legal strategy for employers to mandate that an employee basically take an emergency use vaccine. I think it creates some significant potential liability. Imagine an employee says, I have a right to refuse a vaccine. Well, nope, I'm going to fire you if you don't take this vaccine. Well, you're now firing the employee for exercising their legal right under a federal law. That is a quintessential case of retaliation. But what after the FDA approves the vaccines? And I think we're getting closer in terms of Pfizer's application. Dr. Sayone, I don't know if you have any up-to-date information on that, but I believe that it's undergoing that final approval process right now.
Yes, you're totally correct, Marie. Both Pfizer and Moderna have submitted for that full approval to the FDA. So, but it's hard to predict how long that'll exactly take.
Right. So, so if you have a finally approved vaccine, the employee can't say, I have a right to refuse because now it's finally approved. So does an employee ever have a right to refuse a vaccination? Well, yes, under both state and federal law, an employee can refuse to be vaccinated for religious reasons or for disability reasons. And an employer cannot retaliate against an employee for exercising that legal right. So if an employee says, I have a medical disability that puts me at risk for an adverse, potentially lethal reaction to a vaccination, and gets a medical note from a doctor to that effect, the employer then in that situation has to provide a reasonable accommodation for that employee. That could include masking, using an N95, working remotely. So obviously it would be a significant legal risk to terminate an employee for exercising that risk. Weird creature of California law. We actually have protection for political beliefs and activities in California. Interesting question. Is having a belief that vaccinations are evil and that they, this is all a hoax and that this pandemic is a conspiracy of some political party. If an employee says, I have a political belief that I am opposed to vaccines, technically under the California Labor Code, they may be engaging in a protected activity. Welcome to crazy California. So even after the approval of these vaccines, employees have exceptions. And, you know, the question and concern about mandating vaccines across the board is that the exceptions could threaten to dwarf the rule. So a lot of employers are deciding to go with an encouragement, incentivization kind of program rather than mandatory vaccines. CDC is focused on voluntary compliance, and then there's other implications under the California right to privacy, et cetera. Bottom line, should employers terminate employees who refuse to be vaccinated? Sure, if you want to get sued, go right ahead. Sorry. All right, what are the questions? Can you require employees to receive the EAU COVID-19 vaccine? That's the temporarily emergency use vaccine, not without potentially invoking a retaliation claim, because that employee has a federal right to refuse the vaccine. What about afterwards? You can asterisk 3 exceptions: disability accommodation, religious accommodation, and political belief. So again, that is why you may not be surprised to hear that as recently as May 25, 83% of employers are reluctant to mandate vaccines. 4% have mandated and 13% are undecided. Now, I think that's probably a good indication of where employers are seeing the risk. What are some of the legal issues implicated by vaccine inquiries? So you're an employer and you want to ask for vaccination information. If you ask for it, you need to have job-related reasons that are consistent with business necessity. As the ETS stands right now, CalOSHA is not distinguishing between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. The masking, the physical distancing, the standards are equal for vaccinated and unvaccinated. So it doesn't really support a job-related reason to ask about vaccine status. One exception, Santa Clara County last week said it's $5,000 a day for those employers who do not ask about vaccine status. In that situation, an employer has a compelling job-related and business reason to ask for vaccine status. If the ETS, the CalOSHA, follows CBHP on June 17th, it's going to be much easier for an employer to say, well, look, CalOSHA distinguishes between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. We now have a compelling reason to ask. But CalOSHA, of course, doesn't look out for the privacy issues that I want to tell you about. What should an employer avoid asking? You should ask pretty much, were you vaccinated? Were you not vaccinated? Do you decline to answer? And you want to limit the request. You don't want to ask, what's your reason for not getting vaccinated? You don't want to know if it's a disability or a religious reason or a political belief. Don't ask them why they did not receive a vaccination, and don't ask them to provide any medical information. If CalOSHA comes out and says you need an actual vaccination record, fine, but you don't really need to ask for any medical diagnosis or any sort of HIPAA private information. And I see a question in the chat, where does HIPAA come in? I'm going to talk about that just in a moment. Now, if you're a business covered under the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, you do need to provide a privacy pre-collection notice to the employee under the CCPA. So what are the privacy issues? The businesses that do more than 25 million in annual gross revenue or collect 50,000 or more California residents' personal information in a year are subject to this California Consumer Protection Act. And employers who are subject to this act have to provide a pre-collection notice of the fact of collection, the purpose for which you're using the vaccine information, and what third parties you're going to share it with. Vaccine information cannot be collected if you do not provide this notice to the employee. I didn't include a HIPAA slide, but I will say for those employers covered by HIPAA, you're going to have those potential overlapping HIPAA requirements as well. And of course, keep all medical record information in a separate file from the employee's personnel file. It has to be confidential. I just wanted to mention some COVID litigation trends. Because that is obviously on all of our minds. How do we prevent ourselves from getting sued? There has been a lawsuit to stop an employer's mandatory vaccine program. It was filed in the Central District, that's the federal court in LA in March. And it was teachers suing the LA Unified School District. And it was a request to issue an injunction to stop the issues of mandatory vaccines. And so we've been trying to track that, but that probably also tells you why 83% of employers have decided not to mandate vaccines. I just wanted to give you a heads up because I keep tracking all of the public, federal, and state court filings, that some of the claims we continue to see being filed is employees who raise concerns about safety. You haven't provided me with an N95 mask and I'm not vaccinated, and then they're terminated. The employers are being sued for whistleblowing regarding safety. Employers have been sued because they didn't cooperate with they didn't post the San Diego reopening plan at their business. They didn't comply with the Cal OSHA requirement that you have a written COVID-19 prevention plan. So all of these claims are being filed in court. We also see discrimination against employees for age, race, disability, or COVID stereotypes. An employee says, I can't come to the workplace because I live with elderly parents and I don't want them to contract COVID. The employer refuses to accommodate that and terminates the employee. We're seeing those types of claims as well. Under the emergency temporary standards, if you have to exclude an employee from the workplace because of an exposure in the workplace to COVID, you have to provide exclusion pay. And of course, we have the California COVID paid sick leave law that came into effect. And so we've seen lawsuits saying, hey, this employer didn't pay me for my COVID paid sick leave. Failing to provide a reasonable accommodation. An employee says, I just don't feel comfortable working in the office. I have an immunocompromised system and I have asthma and I really want to work remotely. The employer can accommodate, but refuses to say, nah, you're fired. Again, that's going to be the type of lawsuit that employers are seeing. And of course, last year, sadly, we saw many more layoff lawsuits being filed where employers were under the gun to do massive layoffs suddenly because of the pandemic. And we've seen some lawsuits come out of that. Wage and hour, class, and PAGA action. Those are the claims under the California Labor Code. Employers who have to suddenly send their entire workforce home on March 19th because they're not an essential business. They end up having to have their employees use their home Wi-Fi, their cell phone, and in the race to get their employees online at home, didn't pay them for their cell phone, pay them for their internet usage. We've seen those lawsuits being filed. Employees had to stand in line getting the temperature check before they entered the building because the San Diego County Public Health Order required that. Employee said, hey, I stood in line for 15 minutes and I wasn't on the clock. You owe me 15 minutes of pay for every day. Those lawsuits have been filed. Missed rest meal periods while working from home. Who knew? So those are all the types of claims we've seen. This is just a brief slide to say, preventing employment liability, just some kind of tips. Make sure you're training your supervisors on how to deal with complaints, taking safety complaints, concerns, asking for accommodations. Make sure that supervisors are listening with empathy and trying to be resilient and flexible. Promptly investigate those concerns. Make sure that you're trying to stay on top of all of the changing laws. Thank you, San Diego Regional Chamber, for helping businesses do that. Train supervisors on the vaccination issues. If an employee says, I'm not vaccinated, don't ask why. If an employee says, starts gossiping about others who are not vaccinated, shut it down. Provide the privacy pre-collection notice before you ask about vaccine status. Don't retaliate based on vaccine status. We're starting to hear some impatience as people really just want everything to go back to normal. They're saying everyone should be vaccinated. And there's a lot of very diametrically opposed kind of positions on that. And it's a very polarizing issue. Keep medical information private. The fact that an employee has been vaccinated is a medical issue. It has to be kept private. So supervisors shouldn't go around openly talking about Joe in the county. He's not been vaccinated. Stay away from him. Understanding why employees sue. Employees sue not because of what happened necessarily, but how it happened. They feel they were disrespected, they were treated unfairly, they feel like they were kept in the dark, the rules were unfairly applied, the employer didn't play by the rules, didn't go with the safety standards in place. So just understand that you have an opportunity while the employee is still on your payroll to prevent a lawsuit. And if you engage the employee and listen to their concerns, they're not going to go and talk to a lawyer. Because once they go and talk to the lawyer, there isn't going to be a conversation anymore. There's going to be a lawsuit. You want to hire and train strong leaders. Employees often sue simply because of a bad boss. Treating employees with dignity and respect. If they're not working out, let them leave the company. I have some great HR professional clients who say, we love them out of the company and we invite them to be successful elsewhere. communicate effectively, empathy, active listening. When in doubt, shut your mouth is the end of that really rude one. Providing coaching and mentoring, and most of all, I think why I wanted Dr. Johnston's title is being resilient now as an employer is more important than ever. And if all things go wrong, you really have to exit an employee, consider getting a release agreement. It's the only guarantee that they can't sue you. So I went through that. I saw a couple of questions about whether we'll provide slides. I'm sure we will, but with that, it's back to Jerry and our Stephanie.
Thank you, Marie. That was so informative. I'm getting text messages and there's chat requests for both your and Gary's presentations. We will be sharing those, so don't worry. But I'm going to take the privilege of, the host organizational VAST and I'll ask a quick question of Dr. Sayone before we get into this, because I think the vaccination status, the progress we're making in the county is so critical to what we've been able to do with regard to reopening. But there is vaccine hesitancy, there's misinformation. And what should businesses be thinking, Dr. Sayone, about the long-term safety issues with regard to folks who just will not get vaccinated? Do we have a concern that that group is too big to manage, or how are we supposed to be perceiving that?
Thank you, Stephanie, and great question. There's, just parts of our population that can't even get the vaccine, right? So we have to keep that in mind in terms of truly achieving herd immunity, that some folks aren't even eligible yet. But then amongst everyone who is eligible, 12 and over, we know that it is normal, natural for people to have questions, especially when vaccines were developed in record time, et cetera. But on the other hand, we're so lucky and blessed to have such access and to vaccines that were developed so quickly and are extremely effective, like you pointed out, not just in preventing the infection, but also in preventing you from getting really sick or passing away from the disease. It's not zero. We actually announced our first post-vaccine fully vaccinated person who ended up getting COVID infection, nothing to do with the vaccine, and passing away from it in San Diego, but it is extremely rare. In terms of long-term safety concerns of having an unvaccinated population, yes, there are. I mean, there's data in California that the LA Times put out where they analyzed rural counties or certain counties against each other, and they saw that current COVID case rates actually are higher in counties, and especially rural counties in North California, where there's less vaccinated population. And there's also data like that in the US, that less vaccinated populations are having kind of these higher case rates in general, right? That's not always true, but in general, when you look at the data. But in terms of safety of the actual vaccines, we know these are really safe vaccines. These were the most diverse trials ever conducted. They are very large trials, but then after the trials, and I understand some of the concern initially, you don't want to be an early adopter necessarily, but right now you are not an early adopter if you're getting vaccinated. It's been used in millions of people around the world, and let alone America. And yes, there are rare but serious adverse effects that we've seen, whether serious allergic reactions with all three of the vaccines that are rarest in Johnson & Johnson, or in J&J and Johnson & Johnson vaccine, these rare but serious blood clots that we've seen, particularly in women under 50. But the good news is that we do have that choice, and we have the ability to, if you don't want this flavor, get this flavor of the vaccine, and it is widely available and accessible. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A that's been submitted. And speakers, feel free to just jump in if you think you've got the answer to these. This first one, do we need to keep temperature screening our employees before they enter the office?
So I just checked the San Diego County Public Health Order, and it hasn't been updated since May 6th. So it currently states, yes, you do. I'm hoping with June 15th around the corner and June 17th with Cal OSHA that maybe San Diego County would update that order at that time, but maybe Dr. Johnston or Dr. Sayone have a lead on that.
Hey, Marie, thanks. I'll start and then Sam can pile in. And I have to be clear so everybody knows, and I appreciate it, Marie. I'm not a doctor. I'm a retired Marine colonel, infantry officer. So I do a lot of talking with my hands and crayons and things like that. But
Honorary.
yeah, I'm an honorary. Dr. Sayone has been a great tutor of mine, mentor of mine on all things on the public health side. Yeah, you're right. We definitely only update that public order when there's an absolutely need to amend it. And so quite frankly, what we have done over the last year, and I was amazed that you said 448 days. I'm like, oh my goodness. But over the last year, we've got it to a point where it links to a lot of the existing guidance documents out there, whether they're public health or they're Cal OSHA. So we really don't have to update it until there's something obviously that gets updated. And so anyways, but that's a great observation. With respect to the screening, and things are changing. Matter of fact, the draft ETSs, as you well know, Marie and others, indicates that it really gives, if and when, gives you an option to do temperature checks. But again, those have not been approved. They were pulled back. So right now, screening is required for employees. The employer can have them do those on their own. But I always tell folks that you need to have, that means to inspect what you expect, that it's getting done. But it is a reasonable alternative to have your employees do them at home, their own screening. On the public side, there's no requirement for anybody to basically be screening folks that come to your church as a congregant or come into your business as a patron. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And for some events and activities that event planners have, sometimes they do that, but it's not a mandatory requirement. So I hope that answers the question on that one.
Great, thank you.
Stephanie, I
yeah.
will just say that if you are doing temperature checks, whether you're allowing your employees to do them at home or in the workplace, please make sure you pay them, because those lawsuits are just through the roof on employees who are suing for the 2, 3, 10 minutes it took to do the temperature check when they weren't on the clock.
Marie, follow-up question on that. If I'm employer Joe and my employee is temperature checking at home, and I know that I'm going to pay, is there like a recommended just assign it 10-minute block of time, or do they just tell me it took me 15 minutes to take my temperature, it took me 2? How should I be thinking about that?
California law requires employers to capture exact start and stop times of work for the day. So, in digital age, ideal is a mobile app that allows the employee to record that time, or a manual timesheet, or a manipulable timesheet on a desktop computer when they get to the office to say between 7:30 and 7:40 a.m. I took my temperature. Then I commuted to work, which is non-compensable. And then I started my job at 8 o'clock. So you definitely want to capture actual time, 7 minutes, 4 minutes, 12 minutes. I would not do an estimate, because you're technically not complying with the requirement to keep accurate records of all minutes worked.
Thank you. That is good to know. Okay, our next question. Will customers entering a retail location be required to wear a mask between June 15th through July 31st? So I think this is getting to the June 3rd ETS, but let's revise this question. Will customers entering a retail location need to wear a mask after June 15th?
Let me go ahead and start with that, because I'll review again. This goes back to a little bit of a seam that we have between public health guidance or public guidance for face coverings and guidance for face coverings with the workforce. And I'll focus really on the public. I'm sure Marie can help us out on the workforce side. But we've kind of touched on some of that. Guidance was released yesterday, and it came out from CDPH. It's in effect on the 15th. They start off the guidance document, and I don't know, Sayone, if you can maybe put the link to this in the chat if it's not already out there while I'm talking. But it starts off with kind of reminding you where we are with the current guidance, and then it shifts to what the guidance will be on 15 June and beyond. And so just to kind of keep it very basic, not go into every sentence, guidance for individuals is a category where it talks about the masks are not required for fully vaccinated individuals. except, and then they outline 5 different areas. And I'll just, again, briefly, public transit, which talks about the airplanes, trains, buses, things like that. Indoors and K through 12 child care or youth settings. And again, it says even in a note there that we're anticipating the CDC to come out with some updated K through 12 guidance that will, I think, ultimately amend this document when it comes to what we do with our kids in school and our teachers and staff. The third category for where there's an exception is you need to wear them regardless of your vaccination status in a healthcare setting, state and local correctional facilities, detention centers, and then finally in homeless shelters, emergency shelters, or things like cooling centers, which actually is going to be important because next week we're going into a heat wave where we're going to be activating a lot of our county cooling centers. Now, what it goes on to say is it goes on to talk about unvaccinated individuals. And the new guidance says, again, I'm sorry if you've already read this, but it's required for unvaccinated individuals in indoor public settings. And they give examples such as the retail, restaurants, theaters, meetings, state and local government offices, things like that. What it doesn't specifically address is the outdoor venues for your unvaccinated. And so what it does tell you, though, is to refer to CDC guidance. When you go into CDC guidance, it simply says for unvaccinated, it is recommended to wear a face covering when you're in an outdoor setting around other people, especially where you cannot maintain 6 feet of physical distancing from folks who are not of the same household. It goes on a little bit down farther, and I won't get into it because this is an area where I literally just sent a question to the CDPH because I have a question, but it talks about guidance for businesses, venue operators, and hosts as far as how you're going to differentiate. It's kind of what Marie talked about. It says here, that you'll have for unvaccinated individuals, it'll say that businesses, operators, and hosts may choose to, and they give you 3 options of things that you can do to try to determine the vaccination or the unvaccinated status of folks. You can provide information to all patrons and on the vaccination requirements. You can implement a vaccine verification drill. Remember, it was not mandatory. I mentioned that to you, but it could be something that you could do, or you just simply require all your patrons to wear masks. This goes back to why you might want to keep that safe reopening plan in place if you're going to be a little bit more restrictive and maintain masks and keep that signage up for a while. And again, a lot of businesses do different operations, do different things, and there may be really, really good reasons why they want to be more restrictive or not so. The question that I have going to the state, so you all know, is when it talks about the businesses, venue operators, and hosts may choose to. That is not a mandate, have to do one of these 3 options. And so my question to the state, and I'm sorry I'm looking at this screen. This is the big screen. The camera's over here, so apologize for that. But I'm asking the state, well, does that mean they have an option not to do anything? And that basically the self-attestation comes in the form of somebody walking into their business with a mask or without a mask. What we don't want to do, and this is my personal opinion, and I'm concerned about it, is that when you require an unvaccinated individual that have to have a mask when they go into a particular business setting, is there could potentially be a conflict. And we do not want our employees, a hostess at a restaurant or anything else, to be in some kind of a verbal altercation with somebody that's very emotional and adamant on why or why not they need to be wearing a face covering. And so what I am trying to communicate early on, again, is just came out, is look at that first option, is to provide information to all patrons. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a verbal. You could tell somebody, hey, if you're not in a mask, I walk in, say, are you vaccinated? I could say, yeah, that's an attestation. So come on in. But if you do not want to get any type of verbal discussion on this matter, which is a good suggestion, then put up a sign, put up, some directions of how you communicate can be obviously more visual than it needs to be audible. And so that's one of the options that you have if you want to try to maintain some greater safety for your patrons. And if you do that, obviously you potentially are providing greater safety for your workers that are going to be obviously interacting with the public. So I'll stop there. There's the typical exemptions are in here. Those are the same exemptions that you probably are familiar with if in fact you have any type of disability where you can't wear a mask. It talks about the kids and the ages 2 years and younger. But I'll take a breath there. That's your public face covering guidance update as I know it. Dr. Sayone or Marie, do you want to pile on?
I would just say that, as of yesterday morning, we thought that the Cal OSHA standard was going to be, if you're vaccinated, you can be without a mask in a room with others who are also fully vaccinated, but if they're not, it's face coverings. And that for those who are unvaccinated, the employer had to provide an N95 for voluntary use. Those were withdrawn. So what we're hoping, and what we heard in the public hearing, was that there is going to be more alignment, that those who are vaccinated don't have to wear a mask and those that are vaccinated do. And so that's going to then set up that vaccinated, unvaccinated dynamic in the workplace. And it depends on risk tolerance. Some employers are like, we're so sick and tired of these masks, take the masks off. We're going to ask all about vaccine status. We'll comply with the CCPA. We'll get the notice out there and we'll find out and deal with the outliers. And then there's others that say, we don't want to distinguish between the vaccinated and unvaccinated. We don't want people going around with the N95 like a scarlet letter. Let's just give everyone N95s and not distinguish between anyone. So it's really going to come down to somewhat of a business philosophy and risk tolerance. So that's kind of where we're going. It looks like by June 17th from Cal OSHA on the masks in the workplace.
Thank you. And thank you, Gary, for calling out that vulnerability that so many staff are feeling given some of the tension. I know I speak for our members when I say that it is a really encouraging thing for us to know that you are thinking about that first and foremost, about the emotional and physical safety and well-being of our staff as we all tread into very unknown territory. So we'll go ahead and go into the next question. Do we expect employers to be able to require employees to provide documentation of their vaccination status? And can the employer use this information to make operational and scheduling decisions? i.e., and this is something we've heard about, scheduling all of your vaccinated folks for one shift and another shift be fully unvaccinated people.
So I'll go back to the slide where it says you have to have a legitimate business reason and a job-related reason to ask about vaccine status. As of right now, the existing standards from November issued by Cal OSHA does not distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. So I could see, however, in a medical setting where you have maybe an ICU or neonatal unit, or where there's just individuals who are just at such a higher risk of contracting COVID, where an employer would have a legitimate business reason to protect patient safety, to distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. But the general employer in the office, manufacturing, retail environment at this point in time on June 10th really doesn't have that basis. I believe if Cal OSHA goes to this, if vaccinated employees don't need to wear a face mask, and unvaccinated need to be provided with an N95, at that point in time, you can ask the information and you can use it to, for example, schedule all the vaccinated employees to work in a single location versus others. The risk to employers legally is that if you delineate too much between the vaccinated and unvaccinated, given that there are legal protections for potentially unvaccinated, such as they have a disability that prevents them from getting vaccinated, or a religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccinated. If you acquire that information as an employer, there's a risk you'll be accused of retaliating against an employee, not because they didn't get a vaccine, but because of their disability. You saw this as an opportunity to get rid of your sick and religious people. I'd love to tell you that frivolous lawsuits are never filed in the state of California against employers, but they are. So just something to keep in mind, that you really limit what you ask for with the vaccine. Were you vaccinated? Were you not? Do you decline to state? And then move on.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to jump over to questions from the chat real fast, make sure we're getting all of our feedback. Our organization works with the homeless and formerly incarcerated population. Does anyone know the status of vaccinations in prisons and jails?
I can start, and others please pile on, but I can say that I don't know, I'm not aware of any kind of public listing of the vaccination, like the numbers or the saturation amongst employees or guests or clients in those settings. But I did want to say that we've always recognized from the beginning, and clearly CDPH recognizes that these are critical settings and populations to make sure we get vaccinated as much as possible and to really encourage vaccinations. And I say that because as you see, and Gary read off the exemptions for the vaccine, for the mask mandates or masking requirements, include places like correctional settings. And there's a lot of studies in places like correctional settings because there's been a lot of outbreaks in correctional settings. And actually one study from the CDC about transmission in a correctional setting was the reason or part of the decision why the CDC changed, if you remember, the definition of a close contact from 15 minutes at one interval to a cumulative of 15 minutes throughout the day, because a correctional officer was exposed throughout the day, a total of, I think, 17 minutes throughout 24-hour period, and then still contracted COVID. So it's absolutely important. I know we, the county, have been working within our county with the sheriff's office, et cetera, and hand in hand to do both testing and vaccination in these settings. So they've been a high priority from the start. And I'm glad that you as an organization are prioritizing that and asking the question. I do just want to take a second and just say, and Anali, if you could please post in the chat, we have the opportunity for us to come to meetings, like this, but also to your own employee meetings or your staff meetings if you want. There's a kind of a cadre of doctors and nurses that we have within the county, and then also contracted through the local medical society that can give vaccine-related talks if you think that'll help just answer questions, dispel myths, and make sure people have the facts so that they can make the most informed decision. Thank you.
That's very helpful to know. Thank you. And maybe a softball question for you, Marie. If they are salaried employees, do they still need to record their time for taking their temperatures at home? I think we've opened a can of worms with this temperature thing.
So sorry about that, but no, you do not. The exempt salaried employee, if properly classified, is not paid by the minute or the hour. They're paid for their overall contributions to the employer in any given work week. So no need to capture the minutes spent taking a temperature check.
And if I could, Marie, I'm going to ask you a question because I'll never pass up an opportunity to have an expert like you help me out. I got a question yesterday. I think it was on one of the telebriefs I was on. I think it was business sector, asking about, you have your employees, but what other employees from maybe another entity that are with your company? I know contractors are not necessarily the responsibility of the employer, but is there any other folks that maybe would not be the responsibility of the employee, like contractors that may be working with you, for you? I don't know if you can answer that question, but it came up. I believe I saw something in the old ETS standards talked about that employers are not responsible, COVID prevention wise, for contractors. But is there any other categories of employees or workers that the employer should know I'm not responsible for them, or I am when it comes to my COVID prevention plan?
It's a good question. I mean, generally, if you truly have a properly classified contractor under California law, they're technically not an employee. However, the law in California changed really dramatically several years back with AB 5, where it's virtually impossible to have a properly classified contractor. So businesses be well advised to consider whether or not the person could retroactively by a court be decided to be an employee and err on the side of caution. You certainly could insert in the contractor agreement a requirement that they comply with your COVID written prevention protocol, just to kind of as an abundance of caution. But it also just prompted what you said earlier, Gary, that you're going to have this phenomenon even in the non-retail or non-public facing situations where you have an office environment and guests are coming in, and that business has decided to go with the honor system, but the employees are walking around wearing masks. So there's just a real kind of weird kind of disconnect happening in that situation. And I'm really hoping that there'll be even more alignment as we move forward. So with the contractors, if you're 100% confident that they're a contractor, no liability, but asterisk whether they're really a contractor.
Thank you.
Okay, and the next question, is there a required form for the CCPA pre-collection notice before we're asking about vaccination status? Or is an email containing the notice sufficient? And can that be part of the same inquiry, or should it be two separate communications? One, the pre-notice collection, and then the secondary inquiry about the vaccination status.
I am not aware of a government established pre-collection notice, so an email should be sufficient. However, you do want to have an employee, some type of sort of an acknowledgement, whether it's a digital signature or a read receipt on an email. They should be separate, even if it's just by minutes, or there's the pre-collection notice and then the separate inquiry. That would be my advice. I'm not a privacy law expert. But one of my good colleagues is, so if you want to follow up with me, I can certainly put you in contact with her, but she's educated me enough to at least spot the issues.
Thank you. How is the employer to deal with a person whose job relies on them being engaged with the general public and they refuse to be vaccinated? What is the liability to the employer if the employee chooses to interact and then contracts COVID? Could the employer be held responsible? And could you terminate them if their choice not to vaccinate no longer allows them to perform their job without putting themselves at risk?
Very big mouthful there. So let's just break it down one at a time. How is the employer to deal with a person whose job relies on them being engaged with the general public and they refuse to be vaccinated? So right now, again, while we're in the emergency use authorization phase of these vaccines, the employee has a legal right to refuse the vaccine. So there's a legal risk to the employer that if they terminate them from refusing to be vaccinated, that they or take any other adverse employment action, a demotion, cutting them from shifts, those types of things. There's a risk of retaliation claim that the employee can bring. What is the liability to the employer if the employee chooses to interact and then contracts COVID? Well, interestingly, the Cal OSHA standard that just got withdrawn sort of addressed this on the issue of COVID testing and said that if you have an unvaccinated employee who's wearing a respirator at the time that they're exposed to COVID, the employer didn't have to pay for COVID testing for that employee, almost implying that that employee who's unvaccinated in the workplace but wearing an N95 couldn't have contracted COVID in the workplace. I'm sure Dr. Sayone can talk about how difficult contact tracing is for where and when the employee actually acquired the COVID infection. So what's the liability to the employer if the employee chooses to interact and then contracts COVID? Again, if they are wearing the N95, they probably still have to provide exclusion pay unless the employer can establish, for example, that the employee admitted that they were living with someone who actually had a case of COVID. That might be a valid basis to not pay exclusion pay. Other things kick in. If the employee says, I got COVID and I want to exercise my right to take COVID paid sick leave under California law, again, exercising a legal right. Anytime an employee is raising their hand and saying, I have this legal right, what I want you to think about is putting that employee in a bubble. It's like, don't pop the bubble, don't mess with the bubble, don't go near with the bubble. Status quo, because otherwise you're going to have a potential retaliation claim. Do you terminate the employee if the choice is not to vaccinate and it no longer allows them to perform the job without putting the employee and the employer at risk? This kind of goes to an exception to when you can reasonably accommodate an employee with a medical disability. It's kind of a whole other body of law. But if an employee poses a direct threat to the health and safety of other employees or to potentially patients or clients, in that situation, a reasonable accommodation could be excluding the employee from the workplace on an unpaid leave of absence. The problem with that is that Cal OSHA is not saying that you need to exclude unvaccinated employees from the workplace. So the state agency responsible for establishing safety standards for the workplace is not saying only allow vaccinated employees come to work, exclude unvaccinated employees. So we know from when the avian flu and swine flu was around years ago, and we were dealing with these types of employment law claims, anytime that an employer looked to the government experts, CDC, Cal OSHA, CDPH, and complied with the standard that the government agency was establishing, the employer was seen as reasonable by the courts. But anytime the employer was doing crazy stuff like stereotyping and excluding people and firing people out of kind of a fear that wasn't tethered to some government guidance, that's when the court was throwing the book at the employers and saying, no, that's retaliation. You're histrionic, employer. We're going to punish you for not being reasonable and following government guidance. So where does that bring you? Go back to Cal OSHA, go back to CDPH. Right now, I would not advise any employer to do anything different until we know what's going to happen on June 17th for Cal OSHA workplace standards. That would be my advice.
Thank you. And we're just going to keep going down this line. We've got a bunch of N95 questions now. My concern is N95 fit testing for the unvaccinated and obtaining N95s that fit the face size of our affected population. Has this been addressed?
I'll start. I mean, I will just tell you that we noticed that when the draft ETSs came out that had been pulled back. And again, I'm not the smartest guy out there, but I just thought, you know, I was one of the first folks, as Sayone knows, with Dr. Eric McDonald at Marine Corps Air Station when we started receiving the Chinese nationals, and then later on the folks off the Princess cruise ship. And I was watching even our hospital professionals going through fit testing of N95s and how the success rate of how the fitting was going. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. The skill set you kind of need to do it right. Otherwise, the N95 is relatively useless, not maybe useless, but less effective. So anyways, I definitely we called that out. And I think it was also called out in the meetings that they've had, the board meetings. But quite frankly, it's still in there, and they've kind of looked like they've kind of dropped it on the employer to kind of quote unquote get it fitted, make sure they're wearing it correctly. Well, when you say wear it correctly, that to me is fit testing. And that's not something that you just read on the back of a napkin on how to do. But Sayone, why don't you help us out with that? But that's what I know with respect to the N95. It was in there. We'll see if it's going to remain in there with the updated Cal OSHA guidance that should be coming out on the 17th.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. You're absolutely right. These masks, the lessons that we've learned from just face coverings in general is that the fit and the seal absolutely matter. And that's why, you know, in recent months, CDC, CDPH have come out with guidance just for even face coverings, not N95s, and how to better seal, you know, double layer, things like that. So you're keeping your diseases out from other people and other people's diseases out from getting into your respiratory pathway. So that same rule and logic applies to N95. If it's not fitted correctly, you know, won't be optimal. So I thought, and correct me, Gary or Marie, I saw in the language from Cal OSHA the proposed language that, you know, employers at least just have to do a seal check or something like that, mention of a seal check. And that's kind of a quick and dirty way to often, you know, just to make sure that it's generally a good fit, even though it may not be, or it is not as good as doing an official fit testing.
I saw in the standard that just got withdrawn, there was a training requirement that, so, you know, very frustrated employers out there saying, look, we did all of the COVID-19 training that Cal OSHA asked us to do last year, and now you want us to do training on how to properly fit into N95 masks. So that's what I saw, is that the employer is expected to train employees on how to be fitted on N95s.
Yep.
And that's quite a process. I'll just say that there's
unrealistic. It
yeah,
is an unrealistic expectation, exactly. And it's just like trying to basically enforce the masking for the unvaccinated. And this does strike our law enforcement folks, obviously, and our compliance teams. It's you know, they're just kind of raising their hands. It's like, The last thing we want a law enforcement officer to do is be between, a vaccinated and unvaccinated folks having a dispute about whether or not I'm wearing my face covering. I really don't think the law enforcement are going to put themselves in that position. We look for egregious violations, really is kind of where we focus our resources. But this is going to be one that I see, again, I'm just a common sense guy. It's going to be extremely hard for some of your very small businesses out there to comply with that. Anyways, that's just, again, Gary's, unvarnished opinion, but I've seen it in action. It is not an easy procedure to do it. And it's going to be a challenge.
So just to clarify, a YouTube video is not going to qualify as training for fit testing and a N95 mask for an employee.
Well, that seems like a little bit of bad news. And I, having watched the Cal OSHA hearing last night, I will say that some of the board members were pretty clear that they were sold on N95s being the necessary requirement. So unless staff deviates from that, or unless there's an overwhelming amount of feedback, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, folks, I will send you the Cal OSHA email address. Let them know kind of what that could mean for your employees. Okay. If we do ask vaccination status and have N9,
Stephanie?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Sayone, just wanted to say on your comment that you just raised, even in healthcare settings where folks like me are, under the aerosol transmissible disease standards, we don't always wear N95 all the time. So I work in the county's TB clinic, tuberculosis clinic, for example. Yes, if there's someone with active TB or signs or symptoms, but so it just seems interesting and continues to seem really interesting that this kind of N95 is held up as a gold standard when it's not even always recommended in healthcare settings. So and that's where people are more often sick than others, so it's super fascinating, and I'm glad you all are raising those concerns.
And now that you're bringing it up, I'm just gonna, I think for context, it's helpful for folks to understand how we get to these sorts of discussions. Why do you think, if any of the three of you were throwing guesses out there, maybe an educated guess, how is N95 the standard? Even the board of Cal OSHA yesterday, or the board chair said, I'm not wearing them. I don't like them. They're not comfortable. So how do we get here?
Perception means a lot, and it is true the N95s, they do, they have a role to play. They filter out 95% of I forgot, particles under, I think it's 5 microns or 3 microns or something. So they work, but for them to really be optimal, you have to fit test people. I'm not saying they're totally non-effective if you don't fit test, but it's a little bit of overkill if you're not in a setting where you're really truly exposed in that close interactions and with individuals who are really contagious. So that's just interesting because to your point, right, it is very uncomfortable, and if people are uncomfortable, if people are going to sweat more, if they're going to have heat rashes, especially outdoor people, then that's going to affect your compliance, whereas something like a cloth face covering is much more tolerable to most people. So I'm guessing it just got there just because if you, on paper, yes, it is probably the best level of protection, but that doesn't mean that that's always the most practicable or necessary in all settings.
Dr. Sayone, I had a quick question on the N95. How long can they be used? Is it a one use per day?
Yeah, most of them are for single use, but many of us, we do reuse, and even especially during the pandemic because of the shortage, and many institutions are continuing to reuse, but what they do is they'll put it in a brown paper bag, and then every 5 days they'll reuse that one or something like that. So that way that any COVID germs, if there was any exposure, was taken care of. And of course, if it's actively contaminated because you're dealing with a known COVID person or patient, and you had kind of splashes or things that are exposures, then you would not want to reuse those ones.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and our next question, if we do ask vaccination status and have N95s available for unvaccinated employees, do we need to insist that the unvaccinated employees wear them or just provide it? So this is is it voluntary, or what happens if they don't want them?
Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, you can't force them. I think the guidance, again, everything could change with the updated Cal OSHA ETSs, but it even says in there it's for voluntary use only. And they can potentially, if they wanted to, use their own face covering. They don't have to use the N95, but it's got to be provided by the employee. That's the way I read it.
Okay, thank you. I understand that N95 provision was an option for employers. Oh, so this is from the earlier ETS. I understood that the N95 provision was an option for employers who choose to part from social distancing. So if an employer does continue the distance practices, N95 wouldn't be needed, and then regular face coverings would be enough. So this is kind of similar to the last question, but do we have any additional information there? If you're distancing, you don't need N95s. Do we think that's going to be the case?
I will tell you that I don't, if it's in a, if it's in a setting, an office setting, if you look back to the other face covering guidance, it didn't matter if I was 6 feet away from Sayone. If I was still in a setting and we weren't vaccinated, we had to be in face coverings. It says that if you're in an office alone, totally alone, then that's a different situation.
Okay. And now we've got a couple clarifying points on some of the dates we've been throwing around. And I think this question makes a lot of sense. Please clarify the significance of the following dates: June 17th, June 27th and 28th, and July 31st as it relates to safe reopening. We remained open through the pandemic, and on what date do we modify temperature checks and facial coverings?
I nominate Gary,
Yeah,
Chief Resiliency Officer on that one.
Thanks, appreciate that. Okay, well, I think I got most of the dates down. I mean, because I think I confused somebody on June 27 versus 28, but here we go. The first question was about June 17th, and that is actually, Marie laid that out and I really do want your slides. Those were fantastic. But that date is when they're going to basically vote again on the draft ETSs. And so that's that date. The 27th is when they're going to go into effect, according to Marie. I just heard orally the 28th. So I would take Marie's 27th. So disregard the 28th. But again, those dates will become more clear. Somebody had mentioned July 31st. Now, July 31st initially, and I've been on CDPH calls or calls with the county public health officers, including the state public health officer, and they usually bring in a Cal OSHA rep. At least they have been over the last couple of meetings to get an oral update. One of the last ones that I was in indicated that the draft standards that were being pulled back, they were going to be in effect through 31 July. And when we finally saw the draft standards and we tried to pick through it, some things definitely were anchored to 31 July. Matter of fact, physical distancing, it said after 31 July, you didn't have to physical distance. So the 31 July was a key date in the last draft of the ETS standards. I was also told, again, orally, that all the standards would be retired or terminated at 31 July. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but bottom line, that's where you hear that 31 July date. Now that they're shifting the ETS standards all the way till be in effect in 28 June, I heard this morning, again, I'm telling you what I hear, but do not panic and don't throw me under the bus for it, is that these ETS standards, there may be a consideration to keep them in effect all the way through until the state's declaration of an emergency is terminated, which could take us all the way to 31 December. Now, when I heard that, I about fell out of my chair. That's not going to go very well with a lot of folks that have been doing everything everybody's asked them to do with respect to vaccine and everything else. And we're still going to be, under some kind of restraints all the way through to the end of the year. So really I ask people just to kind of take a deep breath and give it a little bit of time. We know they're going to look at these ETSs again. They're going to vote. We'll get to see what they are. People like Marie will be all over it. Maybe can come back, do a cameo appearance, come back to us and tell us all exactly what it means. The only other date that didn't get mentioned is the 15th. And the 15th is the big date when they're going to retire the blueprint. No more tiered system. It's gone away. And so we'll be in kind of what's called the beyond the blueprint setting for the state. And really the only thing that really gets after with respect to restrictions is the mega events that I talked about. And then whatever we're going to get restrained, whatever restraints or protocols we get for the workforce. There's a couple other dates. If you want to go into dates, let's go into this one. 1 September is when the CDPH is going to assess beyond the blueprint. They're going to take a step back and take a look at 1 September. Where are we with hospitalizations, vaccines, deaths, case rates? If they like where we are, I don't know what the metric decision points are. They will probably, or they're saying they will lift the other restrictions on mega events. If they're not necessarily satisfied, we go to 1 October. Right now, 1 October is the date that's out there where they will lift the restrictions on the mega events. So there's a 1 September date and then a 1 October date. I could go on, but that's probably enough dates right now, unless there's some more out there that could throw them my way.
The only thing I would add is that June 27th happens to fall on a Sunday. So it may be that there was a reference in the public hearing of making it effective June 28th, which would be a Monday. So that might be a source of the confusion.
Thank you for clarifying that. And yeah, we'll be communicating a lot of this via email if you're a chamber member. So stay tuned as all this comes out. Another interesting, basic, but maybe not so easy question. Has anyone got a definition of what a quote unquote room is for the interpretation of employees in the same room? Would a small office qualify? A cubicle? What is a room in this world?
Okay, I'll start. Again, I don't have a definition. I'd have to go back. When you look at the ETS standards, they do start off with some definitions, and I don't recall the room office space being one. What I could do, and I'd have to do it and get back to you, is look at the office guidance, the CDPH office guidance, and see if it has a definition of what a room is. But I think the thing that I would consider, it goes back to how this this virus is transmitted through droplets and aerosols. And so I think if you take a step back and you know that even I'm sitting in a cubicle right now, I'm fully vaccinated. I get screened twice a day. I mean, I obviously get a lot of activities. I can't talk with a face mask and glasses because I typically fog up. But either way, there's other cubicles that are spread out here, but we're in the same office setting. And so arguably, I would not treat this, my cubicle is a room, because as you can probably look over my shoulder, you can see where, where my wall ends, and it doesn't quite go to the ceiling, and it's not enclosed. So again, common sense guy, man, if you define a room for me, it's got 4 walls and a door, and it's enclosed, and so your cubicle is not that. It does provide you some more protections from droplets in particular, because it's like any other barrier, so that if you couldn't get 6 feet between me and my fellow worker, this is a pretty good setup where you've got some barriers to help protect you. But there still is the open air that you have to concern yourself with. And I think that should be driving your decision-making on respect to the face coverings and the physical distancing and things like that. Sayone, what do you think?
Nothing to add. I agree.
Does anyone feel like singing The Room Where It Happens from Hamilton? It just keeps coming.
I like it. Good Hamilton reference too. We should make more Hamilton references. That tends to.
It's coming to LA November.
Legal needs and
covering.
Hamilton PR. Everything you need from Procopio. Okay, next question. After 27 June, do we anticipate that all non-vaccinated employees will be required to wear some type of face covering in the workplace, and that employers will be required to provide N95 masks, but that the use of the N95 mask is voluntary? So we've kind of covered this, but is there anything you guys want to touch on again?
That's how the standard was worded before it was withdrawn yesterday. So given what I've heard about what was said at the special hearing, and Stephanie, you referenced this, the N95 seems to be appealing to the board of directors, and Dr. Sayone told us why that's kind of a little surprising to him.
Okay, we're cutting down the last couple minutes, so hopefully we can get through these final ones. If an employer provides an incentive upon employee providing proof of full vaccination, no copies are permitted. The employer can only ask to see the card. is the privacy pre-collection notice required? There's no documentation being added to a file in this situation.
Yeah, this came up in the context of the temperature checks and whether or not an employer was going to keep any record of that. And you know, again, the CCPA is a really new statute, and you know, we've seen very few lawsuits actually interpreting it, or you know, so at this point, it really, I think it's kind of a risk tolerance for that employer. I tend to be conservative because I don't want businesses to get sued for technical violations. So in that situation, I might do some sort of a pre-collection notice, even though nothing is going in the file. And in the pre-collection notice, I would say, we're going to ask you about this, but we're not going to store it, and we're not going to share this information with anyone. It's a quick email to send people the pre-collection notice, and I think it's worthwhile.
Okay, thank you. What if the employee that is not vaccinated but is wearing an N95 and the respirator doesn't fit, and the employee doesn't perform daily fit tests? This is what if they're doing some of it, but it's not actually panning out? I think the question would be, is there a legal liability for the employers here? And, you know, what's the value from a health perspective?
I have had some clients get a citation from Cal OSHA during the pandemic for not doing, obviously for certain workplace environments where there was a different standard, like the ETD that Dr. Sayone has referenced. So, you know, it absolutely could be a Cal OSHA citation to the employer for failing to do the test, the fit test. Also, an employee who says, hey, employer, you haven't done any training on N95 fitting, and you're therefore not complying, and the employer poo-poos it, and then coincidentally does a layoff the next week, and that complaining employee is part of the layoff, that employee could bring a retaliation claim, claiming the real reason they were laid off was not a productivity issue, but because they complained. So you've got the civil liability with the lawsuit from the employee potentially. You also have Cal OSHA that could issue a citation.
And thank you. From a scientific perspective, something is better than nothing. So, you know, a face covering, whether it be N95 or not, even if it's not fit tested, is better than nothing. So I know you were asking about the scientific background too, but again, that doesn't mean that you have to use a machete every time you're cooking or something, right? There's more appropriate tools for the job sometimes.
Thank you. I like that machete metaphor.
Right, bad one. I know.
Stephanie, I
Yes.
can probably take it. Maybe one more question. I've got to transition to another call. Sorry about that. Is there any questions left in there that are kind of reopening focus? Because otherwise, Sayone can stay on, and he's as good as I am. But is there anything else that I can help with that's left on the chat?
No, there's not. You know, but I'm gonna take the second and just say thank you so much for making yourself available and for everything you've done for our employer community. We're very appreciative.
No, thanks for the opportunity, Marie. It's great to meet you. Thanks for everything that you're doing as well, and love to get a hold of those slides. And again, we're at your service, the county. The answer is yes. What's the question? Come to us, and we'll help you any way we can. Everybody have a great day and remain flexible.
Thank you.
We actually have one question left, and then we can go ahead and break and return to our day and try to parse through what we've all learned. And that question is, are all employers required to provide N95 masks, including hospitality?
So, I mean, again, based on the standard that got withdrawn yesterday, the way it was worded, it was, you know, all employers except for those that are already under an ETD. There's some other exceptions if you only have one employee who's not in contact with anyone else. So there are a few little exceptions, but I didn't see a hospitality exemption. Did you, Dr. Sayone?
No, you're right. And in the beginning of their FAQs, which apply to the initial ETS, but I don't see that they're going to change it. They do. The first FAQ is the scope of who it applies to, and you pointed out who that applies to, of who's exempt. Sorry. And there's 3 exemptions. Sorry, it's if you have one employee only, or one employee, one person operation, I believe, if everyone's working remote, or if your employees are covered under the ATD standards,
And
aerosol.
they added one more. Thank you so
did
much
they?
for
Okay.
prompting my memory. They said that if there is an employee who is teleworking from a location, and I didn't know why they made that distinction between a remote worker versus an employee teleworking from another location, almost like an employee lives in San Diego County but decides to telework from Arizona. It was almost like they contemplated that situation.
Thank you both. And I'm just going to ask one final question because Sayone, you brought up the FAQs. Could you both help the people tuning in understand that in this process, we are going to have a revised ETS. We'll have a vote on June 17th. It will go into effect on June 27th. Cal OSHA loves to operate via FAQs that are kind of like strange pseudo legal, but definitely legal documents. That's my professional terminology. Marie, forgive me. Can you help us understand what's going to happen after June 17th with regard to FAQs and how an employer might want to prepare for that?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Dr. Sayone.
You're the expert. Good.
I mean, I'm not tracking their website, but they typically try to get some FAQs out there once the emergency standards are adopted. And I understand that it feels like it's gospel, but unfortunately there's this, APA statute in California where, what they put on their website and what they put in the FAQ really doesn't have any legal precedent, but certainly it gives you an insight into how Cal OSHA will approach enforcement. So I think it's a legitimate thing for an employer to say, hey, I looked at your FAQ, screenshot it, by the way, or store it somehow in case it changes. Because if you are ending up facing a citation from Cal OSHA, you want to be able to say, well, on June 3rd, I looked at Cal OSHA's website and it said this, and that's the day you're saying there was a violation. So it's kind of a good idea to, capture a record of what you're looking at on Cal OSHA FAQs.
That's a great point, and I agree with you. It's easier to change FAQs than change a standard that everyone has to vote on, et cetera. And so I think that's why we're seeing sometimes the FAQs being changed or adjusted more often.
That's a really important point for folks to kind of anticipate. And we are watching how incredibly hard it is to update ETS now. So this has been an exciting time. But that does it for our questions. And thank you both for being available to our members. If you have any parting remarks, we'll take those and then we'll go ahead and close it out.
Nope, thank you so much for having us.
And my only parting thought is that I think many of you have already heard me say this, but whether or not you've been infected with COVID-19, our lives, our livelihoods, your businesses, to a large degree have been affected by COVID-19. And we know that the best way back to normal is vaccination. And that's also the best way to keep us at normal because of things like variants and other things that are making it harder to stay normal otherwise.
Thank you. Everybody get vaccinated and we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.